Now, moving to another concept of evolution, that is speciation, means how a new species comes into existence. For that, whatever till so far we have learned, what do we call it? Microevolution. Why do we call it microevolution? Means the changes are small. These were not so big changes that could be easily observed, right? These were small changes, even though they are significant. They are significant. Now we are talking about that how a new species comes into existence. Till now what we were doing, we were talking about the group of beetles. Let's talk about that only. That it has happened that if the group of beetles we were thinking about splits into two populations that could not reproduce with each other. Now when this happens, these could be called two independent species, supposingly the red one beetles. These are here, alright. And the other progeny of the beetle may be on the backside of the mountain or may be on the other mountain, might have reached there. Okay, now these two are two split populations that cannot reproduce with each other. When this happens, then it is called as two independent species. So we can extend the reasoning now how that could have happened. Now, for that also we are starting with the cases. Consider the first case now. In this, if we say the beetles are fed on a widely mountain range, this is a mountain range, a wide mountain range onto which beetles are feeding. But individual beetles feed mainly in a nearby area. अभी यहाँ से तो उड़ के कहीं और नहीं जाएंगी ना, इनके पास इतनी टेरिटरी है, ये इतनी में रहेंगी, right? They do not travel so far, and in this huge population of beetles, there will be subpopulation in neighborhoods also. Like we people say, okay, a colony of people, another colony of people, another colony of people. Same way, these also have few subpopulations in the neighborhoods. Since male and female beetles have to meet for reproduction to happen, most of the reproduction will be within this subpopulation zone. इसके अंदर और इसके अंदर. Right, in these three subpopulation zones. Of course, occasional adventurous beetle might grow from one site to another site, right? Or if a crow picks up a beetle, takes it away, right, instead of without being eaten, drop it here or anywhere. In either case, the migrant beetle will reproduce with that local population, and this would result in the genes of the migrant beetle entering in a new population, entering into a new population. So there are two cases. It may reach there also, it may reach there also. And the kind of gene flow, what is happening now? ये हो रहा है gene flow. Clear? The kind of gene flow is bound to happen between populations that are partially but not completely separated. Between two such subpopulations, if supposingly there is a large river comes into existence, चलो यहाँ पे एक river बना देते हैं, that river has come in between, then these two subpopulations will be further isolated and the level of gene flow between them will decrease even further. Here it is quite a possibility that some of the local populations are similar in characteristics but far away now. They are quite different in their characteristics. So over generations, what will happen? Genetic drift will accumulate. That means accidental changes. Different changes in these subpopulations. Natural selection will also occur. It has to occur. Because crows are everywhere. They are feeding onto this population and these local inhabitants are obviously showing different variations. Then, example is in this territory of one subpopulation if crows are eliminated by eagles. But this does not happen in the other subpopulation. where the crow numbers are very high, what will happen? The green variation will not be selected at the first site, but it will be strongly selected at the second site. What am I talking about is, supposingly in this mountain range, there are two subpopulations. If this one has all the red beetles and this one has all the green beetles, here crow is being picked up by an eagle. Alright, so automatically the number is in check. Here in this population, if number of crows is much more, crow population is much more in number, what will happen? These green ones are not picked up at the first sight, while it will be definitely selected or strongly selected at the second sight. Why? Because it will be automatically picked up by maximum or large number of crow population, as there is no check of eagle here. Alright, so eventually members of these two groups will be incapable of showing variation for a time being. First of all, this one where the crow keeps a check on the eagle, the eagle keeps a check on the crow, crow keeps a check on the beetle population, and automatically crow numbers are very low here, and here the number is very high. So green will be picked. Together, the process of genetic drift and natural selection, it will result in two isolated subgroups of beetles becoming more and more different from each other. Members of these two groups will be incapable of reproducing with each other eventually if they happen to meet. Why? Because see, यहाँ पर एक तरह की वेरिएशन प्रोड्यूस हो रही है, वहाँ पर दूसरी तरह की वेरिएशन आ रही है. If we apply this here, that this crow is keeping a check on the population and eagle is keeping a check on the crow population, here we are applying this, that green ones, if there are in variation green beetles but these are being picked up by the large population of crow, then eventually there is variation, and this variation will not allow these two subpopulations to undergo reproduction at the very first sight. Okay, as these two subpopulations are quite different from each other, though this process of genetic drift and natural selection has resulted into it and made it more and more different from each other. So eventually what will happen? These will be incapable of reproducing even if they happen to meet. There are a number of ways by which this can happen. If number one, we say the DNA changes which has happened, eventually the germ cells of the two groups cannot fuse with each other. Variation has come in the DNA that will not allow this thing to happen easily. Means a new variant emerges in which the green females will not mate with the red males but only with the green males only. If such beetle variation occurs, this ensures that there is no reproduction between them. Automatically what will happen? It will result into a new species. And this formation of new species, it is generated as a microevolution process and is a concept of speciation. Understood? This is how these two factors, genetic drift, natural selection, gene flow, gene migration, these all play an important role. Now there are two more factors that we have studied here. Geographical isolation, which led to reproductive isolation as well. Okay, so which all factors? Genetic drift, natural selection, gene flow, gene migration, geographical isolation and reproductive isolation. This all will lead to the formation of a new species. Another concept of evolution and speciation, where we discuss that the more characteristics of two species of two species in common, the more closely related these are. More closely related these are. And the more closely related they are, the more recent they have a common ancestor. They have had a common ancestor. Now, what is this? I'm taking an example. Supposingly, brother and a sister. They are closely related. They have their common ancestors in the first generation before them. That means their parents. Okay? Now a girl and her first cousin. They too are related, but less than a girl and her brother. This is because cousins have common ancestors, their grandparents. तो उनके parents और ये parents का एक आगे common ancestor आएगा, right? Grandparent. Then they are common. तो हम लोग first, second, third, fourth level की बात कर रहे हैं. If we are comparing the fourth level, obviously this level is far more closely related. Means more characteristics in common, they are more closely related, and they have a more recent common ancestor. Understood? Therefore, we can now appreciate that classification of species is a reflection of their evolutionary relationship. And on that basis, we are going to trace few evolutionary relationships. Again with example. Now, mammals, in mammals, we have 4 limbs. Okay, 4 limbs means we have 2 arms and 2 legs. ठीक है, इनको बोलते हैं 4 limbs. Alright, we have 4 limbs as do the birds have, so do the amphibians have. Okay, we all have limbs. So the basic structure of limbs is similar, though it has been modified to perform different functions in various vertebrates. Right? Basically, what we talk about is, when we talk about this, we say they have a common structure, but they perform different functions. Birds, they have adapted their limbs, the 4 limbs for flight. Okay, 4 limbs are developed into wings. And amphibians, they use it for leaping. So before we jump to any conclusion, we were first talking about that. Chalo, abhi itna hi, that what is it? We say that mammals, birds and amphibians, they have the same organic origin of their structure. And same way we talk about wings of bats and wings of birds. Right? These wings of bats and birds, they have, but squirrels do not have wings, lizards do not have wings. They are also the category of animals. Birds and bats, they are more closely related to each other than squirrels or lizards. Why so? It means if they have wings, like in bats, these are the just skin folds stretched between the elongated fingers. Wings of birds are feathery covering. Clear? And the design of two is very different, but they look similar because they have a common function, common use. Alright, that is flight, but their origin is not common. Origin is not common. It's a skin fold and it's a feathery covering. When the origin and function disparity takes place, we have two different concepts in evolution. One is homology, another one is analogy. Now what is that homology and analogy is? Homology is when we say organisms, they have same organic evolution in their structure, which we call the common structure, right? But they perform different function. Same way analogy stands for, analogy says that when these organisms, they have different organic origins of their structure, but perform a common function. This is called analogy. So mammals, birds and amphibians, they fall in this first category. Wings of bats and birds, they fall in the second category. Homology, it leads to divergent evolution. Can you see it is diverging? So homology is a concept of divergent evolution, which diverges. Analogy, it's an example of convergent evolution. Convergent, the rays are converging and meeting at one point. Okay, now moving to the third concept of evolution, that is tracing evolutionary trends. This is the third trend we are talking about, and that is fossils. What are fossils? We know that fossils are usually when the organisms die, their bodies will decompose and are lost. Right, this is what we know. But it is a dead remain of a plant and animal buried in the Earth's atmosphere years and years ago. The same old definition, it's correct, it's true. Same way we say that for every once in a while, the body or at least some parts may be in the environment does not let it decompose completely. Alright, and if a dead insect get caught in hot mud, eventually it will not decompose quickly and the mud will dry, it will get harder and retain the impressions of the body parts of insect. Clear? So, all such preserved traces of living organisms are called fossils. How do we know that how old the fossils are? So, there are two components of this estimation. One is the relative test. That means we dig into the earth and start finding the fossils. It is reasonable to suppose that fossils we find closer to the surface are more recent. The ones which are closer to the surface are more recent, and the ones which we find in the deeper layers are obviously the older ones. Okay, and the second way of is by the detection of ratio of different isotopes, that is the density method. In this, what do we do? we compare or we detect the ratios of different isotopes of the same element in the fossil material. Okay, it would be interesting that how exactly this method works, since it is not given in the book. It is quite interesting that they compare the isotopes of all different elements which are found in the fossil material, and then they compare the data, and then they say, okay, this is this much years old, and accordingly we get to know the age of the fossils. Now moving to third, how evolution takes place by stages. Now in this, when we say that evolution takes place by stages, sometimes this evolution, it gives us a survival advantage that we have learned. Sometimes this survival advantage is merely an accidental one also. So what about the complicated organs such as eye? Will it be an advantage, or will it provide any survival advantage? But how can we give the immediate explanation that we all have eyes and some of the organisms, they do not have eyes? Okay, eye like the wing. It's a very popular adaptation. It is an adaptation. Basically, insects have eyes. So do an octopus and vertebrates. But structure of eye in each organism is quite different. Why? Because it is mainly an adaptation which tells us that how much is it developed. Same way, there is an example of feathers. We see, we can start out these feathers. These were mentioned for insulation. These meant to provide insulation in cold weather. But later on, they become useful for flight. In fact, some dinosaurs had feathers. They could not fly because it all depends on how do they manage, but birds seems to have later adapted them to flight, and birds are very closely related to reptiles since the dinosaurs were reptiles. Okay, now there are some dissimilar looking structures which evolved from a common ancestor design. So when we look at the structure, the organ structure, we get to know that how these all came into existence. This is all which has happened naturally. But if we talk about a human made artificial selection, that is a plant which is basically worked upon, we say humans also have cultivated wild cabbage. This is an artificial selection. Why do we say artificial selection? Because we have done it, man has done it. It is not naturally selected. Farmers have wanted it to select, and they have selected it for a very short distance between the leaves. If they have worked on leaves, short distance between the leaves, then they have bred cabbage. Same way, if they have to develop for arrested flowers, then they have made broccoli. If they have to look for sterile flowers, then they have made cauliflower. Some have been selected for these woolen parts, and they have come up with kohlrabi. And slightly larger leaves, then that has gone up for kale. Okay, these structures are descendants from the wild cabbage. Now, have it been selected naturally? No, it has been done by man artificially. Okay, so this is an idea that there is a change in the DNA during reproduction, and that change brings the evolution. Acquired traits and inherited traits differ only in this matter. If the change is acquired in the DNA, then it will be further carried on to the progeny. If it is not acquired, it will not. So same way we say that it should not be equated with progress. It should not be wise to say that if a species is eliminated from the nature, it will not emerge. It will emerge, but that definitely with a different outlook, with a different genetic makeup, right? Same way beetle examples, as we have talked about, these no species will eliminate and no species will disappear. It will automatically change or will introduce variation, and we will see its variant. And what do we see today are the variations of those old species which we think have disappeared. Yes, these, if we say technically, these are disappeared, but no species will disappear as such, as its characteristics are passed on in the variation form to the new descendants, and these descendants are further introducing or bringing a change which we call microevolution, and this microevolution is automatically the key to evolution. In fact, in this idea of evolution, there is no real progress. It is the generation of diversity and shaping of the diversity by the environmental selection. What do we say? It is the generation of diversity and shaping of diversity. The only progressive trend in evolution with a more and more complex body design that has emerged over time. They were not ready to adapt, they could not adapt, so their variants adapted and introduced descendants. Same way say human evolution. What happened in human evolution? There is a great diversity in human evolution as well, and features across the planet. We know skin color. It is the most common tool used to identify races. Some are called yellow, some are called black, some are called white and brown. But basically, if we say that regardless of where we have lived in the past few thousand years, we all have come from Africa, and the earliest member of the human species, that is the Homo sapiens, can be traced there. Our genetic footprints can be traced back to the African roots. Basically a couple of 100,000 years ago, some of our ancestors, they left, others stayed there. Why did we leave? We became migrants. We slowly spread across the planet. We went to West Asia, then islands of Indonesia. We traveled down, and then Philippines, then to Australia, then to everywhere else. Okay, and why did we go? Why were we traveling? Obviously, we went forward and backward. It's only because we were the migrants in search of food, in search of shelter, in search of mating, that led to new species. And this is how we all have come into existence, and how the evolution took place. Like all other species on the planet, we have also come into being as an accident of evolution. Okay, our ancestors we are talking about. Now we are left with the topic which is basically a concept of evolution. Here we are talking about why and how the organic evolution, that means how the life came into action. Since we have talked this much, we need to know how the first cell or the first organism came into existence. You know, the major support of this organic origin of life this is basically the abiogenetic or naturalistic or chemical origin of life. In this, basically this we say that life originated from inanimate matter by a series of chemical reactions on this primitive earth. This concept was put forward by Operon and Haldane. A beautiful concept. It was introduced by them, and the title name was Abiogenesis. First, but bio genesis ever since. So basically we all have got our origin from the inanimate matter by a series of chemical reactions on that primitive earth. This suggested that life must have come on this primitive earth from a collection of chemicals through a progressive series of chemical reactions when they were combined together into inorganic molecules, then inorganic into organic, and so on. But where is the proof? The proof of this theory was given up by Miller and Urey. They put forward the simulated conditions to show how this could have happened. What did they do? They designed a glass apparatus. Over there, that time, what did they do? They designed a glass apparatus like this. They introduced a chamber, a flask kind of chamber here. Then automatically the entire water chamber where they introduced the hot and the cold water, basically for hot and cold water. It was connected then to another flask, and ultimately the entire setup is somewhat like this. And this all is airtight, children. All is airtight because we have to show all the simulated conditions which were prevailing at that time in that environmental zone. So basically it is an airtight chamber. We have certain inputs here. That means we make a connection to the vacuum pump and gas supply to remove the original air. We do not want any original air to disturb the simulated conditions that we have maintained in this glass chamber. We have introduced a gas flask also. Why a gas flask? This is a gas flask. Why? To maintain the reducing atmosphere. Because at that time, the atmosphere was not the same as we see today. So we used electrode also. Why? To give a spark. This is a sparker. There is a mixture of gases which is present here, which will be sparked later on. These gases are hydrogen, ammonia, methane, and water vapors. Mind you, no water vapors we basically say as such if we have to use. We cannot say water, so water will split into oxygen and half a molecule of oxygen and hydrogen. Basically we are talking about water vapors because वहाँ पर उस टाइम पे steam होता था. Temperature was too high. Temperature was high. It was just below 100 degrees Celsius. तो उस पर वाटर नहीं, मैक्सिमम स्टीम रिकवर होती है. That provided energy for interaction of gases in the form of electric spark, this temperature. Okay, what did they do? They maintained the same environment. They maintained the simulated conditions that thought to have existed on the primitive earth. They circulated a mixture of methane, a mixture of ammonia, then hydrogen and water vapors. These gases were believed to prevail in the primitive earth, and mixture was maintained at a temperature around 100 degrees Celsius, just below that. And this temperature itself is the energy for the interaction of gases that acted as a spark. At the end of the week, 15% of the carbon from here, from methane, been converted into simple inorganic compounds. Okay, and these inorganic compounds and later on then organic compounds. And these organic compounds that we are talking about are amino acids, then these are simple sugars, purines, pyrimidines. Basically what happened, the entire hot water is eliminated from here and the cold water, it was introduced. Cold water. Okay, and this cold water is used to run here, and at the end here we collected organic compounds. This one particularly on a heater hot plate for the introduction of hot water. This is the boiling water. And this is connected to vacuum pump. Why? Because we want to expel the entire gas supply to remove the original air. Then these water vapors, these reach up, meet the gaseous content here, hot water is removed out, cold water is added, and ultimately this is how it worked. This is about that simple organic compounds interacted in oceans to form complex ones. And such polysaccharides, polypeptides, proteins, lipids, nucleotides, nucleic acids, these are the colloidal aggregates. These aggregates were organized to form a living matter. Okay, to form a living matter. So this tells us what comes and how comes. That is origin of life. That how the first cell came into existence. It might not be a cell exactly the way we see today, but life came like this. Another question. Can life arise afresh from inorganic molecules on earth even now? The answer is no. Why? Because the chemical compounds could be formed in nature even today by lightning discharge or UV radiations. These will undergo spontaneous oxidation and degraded by living microorganisms. You know, we have oxygen in today's atmosphere, and the presence of this free oxygen in today's atmosphere and living organisms on earth at present are thought to prevent the abiotic origin. Basically, that was the reduced atmosphere which helped in the formation. But if we expect this to happen in today's, it only can come from the pre-existing life. Life today is possible only from the pre-existing life, but not afresh from the abiotic, this kind of origin, from inorganic molecules. Understood?